calm criminal.
There are objects that become important because they are extraordinary, and there are objects that become extraordinary because something happens to them. The Mona Lisa belongs firmly to the second category. Before she became the most recognizable image in the world, before she was reduced to a symbol printed on mugs, scarves, and airport magnets, she was simply another painting living a quiet life inside a very large building. A respected painting, certainly, an admired one, but not yet an obsession. The Louvre, at the beginning of the 20th century, did not revolve around her. This is difficult to accept now, largely because the present has rewritten the past in its own image. We assume fame is permanent, that what matters now must always have mattered. But museums do not work that way. They are accumulations, not hierarchies. Thousands of objects coexist, competing gently for attention, most of them content to be appreciated without being adored. In 1911, the Mona Lisa was one such object. Visitors passed her without ceremony. Artists stopped in front of her to copy details of her hands or the softness of her shading, then moved on. Guards stood nearby with the relaxed posture of men who had learned that nothing ever truly happened in this room. She did not command silence. She did not draw crowds. She hung on the wall like a painting that had always been there. That familiarity would prove fatal. The Louvre itself was less a fortress than a living organism. It breathed people in and out constantly. Painters, cleaners, carpenters, photographers, restorers, clerks, guards, all moving through the same corridors, often indistinguishable from one another. White work smocks were common. Tools were carried casually. Doors opened and closed without ceremony. Security existed, but it was conceptual rather than systematic. The building relied on habit, on the belief that those who belonged would continue to belong, and those who did not would stand out. It was a belief rooted in confidence, not negligence. After all, the Louvre had survived revolution, empire, and war. Why would it fear a man with a toolbox? On Monday, August 21st, 1911, the museum was closed to the public. This mattered. Mondays were quiet days, maintenance days, days when the Louvre turned inward and attended to itself. Fewer guards were scheduled. Certain galleries were left unattended for long stretches. The building trusted its own rhythms. Somewhere that morning, a man entered wearing one of those white smocks. He did not sneak. He did not look over his shoulder. He walked the way someone walks when they have walked the same route many times before. He knew where he was going. The Salon Carré was not a restricted space. It was simply a room containing important paintings, none of which were treated as singular. The Mona Lisa shared the wall with other works. No rope separated her from the floor. No glass shielded her from touch. The man lifted her down. There was no alarm to sound, because there was nothing to trigger it. Paintings were removed from walls every day. Frames were adjusted. Glass was replaced. A painting in someone's hands did not signal danger. He carried her toward a stairwell. Stairwells are places that museums forget. They exist to connect rooms, not to be remembered themselves. Guards do not linger there. Visitors rarely enter them. Sounds echo differently. Time feels suspended. Inside that narrow space, the man removed the painting from its frame. The empty frame was left behind. That decision would later mislead investigators. Frames were often removed separately for repair. An absent frame suggested maintenance, not theft. It bought the man time without his ever realizing he needed it. The painting itself was lighter than most people imagine. Painted on a thin wooden panel, she was compact, portable, and terrifyingly easy to conceal. The man wrapped her in his smock and prepared to leave. At that moment, the crime almost failed. A door would not open. It was locked in the way old doors sometimes are. Stubborn without explanation, the man did not panic. Panic attracts attention. Instead, he waited. Waiting is an underrated skill. Eventually, another worker passed by. A plumber on an unrelated task. The man asked for help opening the door. The plumber obliged without hesitation. Why wouldn't he? The door opened. The man stepped outside. Paris continued with its mourning. For more than a day, nothing happened. When the absence was finally noticed, it was not noticed with urgency. It was noticed with confusion. An artist arrived to copy the Mona Lisa and found only bare hooks. He assumed, reasonably, that the painting had been removed for photography. That happened often enough to be inconvenient, but not suspicious. He waited. Only when the wall remained empty did the idea of theft begin to form, slowly, reluctantly, like a thought no one wanted to finish, because the alternative was absurd. Someone had simply taken her. The most damaging part of the theft was not the act itself. It was the time afterward. When the Mona Lisa was finally noticed missing, the Louvre did not erupt into chaos. It drifted into uncertainty. And uncertainty, in institutions, behaves like a sedative. It dulls urgency. It encourages delay. It convinces people that clarity will arrive on its own, if given enough time. The artist who had come to copy the painting waited longer than he should have. He sat with his materials arranged carefully, glancing at the wall with mild irritation rather than alarm. The absence felt temporary. Paintings were removed often enough for reasons that were never explained to visitors. Photography, cleaning, study, reframing. Nothing about the empty hooks felt violent. Eventually, he asked a guard. The guard shrugged. This shrug would echo through the entire investigation. The guard suggested the painting had been taken for photography. He did not check a log. He did not radio a supervisor. He relied on familiarity. The same familiarity that had allowed the theft to occur in the first place. The artist accepted the explanation and waited longer. Hours passed. When the question moved upward, it did so without urgency. A junior curator was consulted. The curator assumed cleaning. Cleaning schedules were checked casually, almost apologetically, as though it were rude to accuse the system of error. No entry appeared. Another curator suggested relocation. Storage rooms were searched slowly. Crates were opened. Corridors were walked. still nothing. At no point did anyone shout. At no point did anyone run. The idea that the Mona Lisa might have been stolen existed briefly, then was dismissed as melodramatic. Theft belonged to stories, not to this place. The Louvre did not lose paintings, it misplaced paperwork. The moment that changed everything was small and unremarkable. Someone asked a question that should never have needed asking. When was the painting last seen? No one could answer. Not precisely. Guards remembered seeing it recently. Artists recalled it being there last week. No one could agree on a specific hour, because no one had been trained to think in those terms. The Mona Lisa's presence had been assumed, not verified. This realization sharpened the mood. The wall in the Salon Carré was examined more closely. The hooks were intact. The surrounding paintings were undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no scratches, no splintered wood. The space looked tidy. Crimes leave disorder. This one had left organization. Police were contacted. They arrived expecting confusion, not catastrophe. The first officers searched offices, storage rooms, photography labs. They questioned staff politely, as though solving an internal misunderstanding. The idea that the painting had left the building entirely felt excessive. Only when these searches produced nothing did the tone begin to shift. The Louvre closed galleries. Visitors inside the museum were escorted out with measured calm. Some were irritated. Others sensed that something significant was happening and were disappointed to be removed from it. Doors were sealed. Guards were posted. The building was suddenly aware of itself. Boarders were notified late. This delay mattered. Trains leaving Paris had already departed. Ships had already sailed. Customs officers received hurried instructions that revealed how poorly defined the object of their search was. Look for crates. Look for suspicious packages. Look for anything unusual. The Mona Lisa was none of those things. She could be folded beneath a coat. Inside the Louvre, interviews began in earnest. Guards were questioned repeatedly, often by different officers asking the same questions in slightly different ways. Memory behaved badly. People filled gaps with assumptions. Times blurred. Details contradicted one another. One guard remembered a man carrying a large object. Another insisted he had seen nothing unusual. A third recalled a painting being moved, but could not say which one. None of them were lying. They were reconstructing routine under pressure. The investigation expanded outward. Contractors were identified. Names were listed. White smocks were suddenly suspicious. But there were too many of them. Workers came and went constantly. Uniforms were shared, borrowed, sometimes left hanging in closets, where anyone might take one. The Louvre had created an ecosystem where access was normal. The police had to confront a difficult truth. If the thief had been clever, evidence would exist. If the thief had been violent, witnesses would exist. But if the thief had been ordinary, he could vanish completely. By the end of the first full day, the Mona Lisa had already begun her transformation. She was no longer a painting. She was a failure, and failures demand explanations. By the second day, the theft had escaped the Louvre. This was inevitable. Institutions can contain mistakes only as long as those mistakes remain invisible. Once absence becomes visible, it begins to attract attention in ways that are difficult to control. The empty wall in the Salon Carré was no longer merely an internal concern. It was a symbol, and symbols are never patient. News travelled through Paris in the way rumours always do, sideways first. A guard mentioned it to a friend. A clerk spoke too freely in a cafe. A journalist overheard a conversation that sounded more interesting than it should have been. By the time the first newspapers went to print, the tone was cautious but unmistakable. A celebrated painting is missing from the Louvre. The wording mattered. Missing suggested error rather than crime. It allowed readers to believe that the situation was temporary, that the painting would be found behind a door someone had forgotten to open. The Louvre itself encouraged this framing, issuing statements that emphasized investigation without acknowledging theft. But uncertainty does not sell papers for long. Within days, the language hardened, stolen, vanished, taken. Each word carried accusation with it. Public reaction was swift and surprisingly emotional. Letters arrived at newspaper offices expressing outrage, disbelief, embarrassment. The Louvre was not just a museum, it was a national institution, a repository of French culture and identity. To imagine it penetrated so easily felt like an insult, not just a loss. Political pressure followed naturally. Questions were raised in government offices about security, oversight, and responsibility. Ministers demanded briefings. Officials who had never set foot in the Salon Carré suddenly required detailed explanations of how paintings were monitored, who had access, and why none of those systems appeared to have functioned. The police felt this shift immediately. What had begun as an awkward internal investigation was now a matter of public credibility. The expectation was no longer that the painting would be found eventually, but that someone would be seen to be doing something. This distinction is crucial. Doing something does not always mean doing the right thing. Investigators widened their scope rapidly. Borders were closed more decisively, though far too late to matter. Railway stations were searched, ports were monitored. Officers were instructed to inspect luggage, crates, parcels, anything that looked capable of concealing art. This instruction revealed a fundamental misunderstanding. The Mona Lisa did not look like art when hidden. She did not require a crate. She did not need to be rolled. She could be folded carefully and carried like clothing. The very qualities that made her resilient as a painting made her dangerously mobile. Inside the Louvre, suspicion intensified. Guards were questioned again, this time with sharper tone and longer hours. Some were convinced their jobs were at risk. Others grew defensive, irritated by the implication that familiarity had become negligence. The same questions were asked repeatedly, not because investigators expected new answers, but because repetition creates the illusion of progress. Who had been in the building that morning? Who had access to the Salon Carré? Who wore white smocks? The list grew impossibly long. Contractors were identified. Names were cross-referenced. But the Louvre's reliance on temporary labour meant records were incomplete. Some workers had been present for only a few days. Others had borrowed uniforms. A white smock did not belong to a person. It belonged to the building. The investigation stalled. And when investigations stall, imagination takes over. The police began to think less about access and more about motive. Who would steal a painting like this? Not for money, surely. No private collector could display it. No dealer could sell it openly. The act felt symbolic, almost performative. This assumption pushed the investigation in a dangerous direction. Rather than looking at those who moved quietly through the building, investigators began looking at those who moved loudly through culture. People who challenged institutions, people who enjoyed provocation, people who might view the theft as a statement rather than a crime. Artists. Paris was full of them. Painters, poets, sculptors, many of them foreign, many of them young, many of them happy to irritate authority. In a city already suspicious of its avant-garde, the theory felt comfortable. The press seized on it eagerly. Stories appeared suggesting artistic conspiracies, radical gestures disguised as crime, symbolic acts meant to humiliate the establishment. The idea of a brilliant artist stealing the Mona Lisa as an intellectual provocation appealed to the public imagination far more than the idea of a quiet worker acting alone. Names began to circulate, and with names came distraction. While Paris speculated loudly, the true shape of the crime remained untouched. The thief had not wanted attention. He had relied on its absence. And somewhere, far from newspaper officers and government briefings, the painting rested quietly, unaware that she was already becoming something she had never been before. A legend defined by loss. When an investigation begins to drift, it often drifts toward familiarity. Not familiarity of place, but familiarity of story. The police were under pressure now, not just to find the painting, but to reassure the public that the disappearance of the Mona Lisa had meaning, that it was not the result of something as banal as routine, that it was the work of someone extraordinary, someone worthy of the scale of embarrassment France had suffered. This instinct shaped everything that followed. Rather than focusing on who had access, investigators began focusing on who had personality. Who would want to do such a thing? Who might enjoy the disruption, the attention, the symbolism? The press helped enormously. Paris was already suspicious of its artists, particularly the foreign ones. They were brilliant, yes, but unpredictable. They mocked tradition. They challenged authority. They made statements instead of products. To many, it was easy to imagine one of them staging a grand provocation. stealing the Mona Lisa not to own her, but to say something. The idea was intoxicating. Journalists speculated openly. Cafe conversations became theatrical. Everyone had a theory, and most of them involved genius behaving badly. The police listened. The first serious arrest was Guillaume Apollinaire. Apollinaire was a poet, which was already a disadvantage. Worse, he was a poet who enjoyed provocation. Years earlier, he had joked, publicly, about burning down the Louvre. The remark had been intended as an attack on institutional complacency. In the context of a stolen masterpiece, it became something else entirely. He was arrested abruptly. The spectacle satisfied no one and pleased everyone. Newspapers reported the arrest eagerly. Readers debated his guilt passionately. The idea that a poet might steal a painting felt narratively correct, even if it made little practical sense. Under questioning, Apollinaire panicked. Panic has a way of producing irrelevant honesty. He mentioned Pablo Picasso, not as an accusation, but as a name. Picasso had once possessed Iberian sculptures that had been stolen from the Louvre by someone else entirely. The matter had been resolved years earlier, but memory is rarely kind to nuance. The connection was enough. Picasso was summoned. The image of it remains quietly surreal. One of the most important artists of the century sitting under questioning, trying to explain that he had not removed the Mona Lisa from the wall of the Louvre. He denied involvement calmly and firmly. His discomfort was visible, not because he feared guilt, but because he understood how easily reputation could become evidence. Both men were released. The investigation had embarrassed itself. But embarrassment did not bring correction. It brought defensiveness. The police doubled down on the idea that the crime must have been theatrical, intellectual, symbolic. They searched studios, questioned artists, entertained theories involving secret societies and political gestures. All the while, the simplest explanation remained untouched. The thief had not wanted attention. He had wanted invisibility. This is the kind of crime institutions struggle to imagine, because it offers no narrative satisfaction. There is no villainous flourish, no manifesto, no grand reveal, just access, confidence, and patience. Meanwhile, the empty space in the Salon Carré became an attraction in its own right. Visitors stood before it longer than they ever had before the painting. They pointed. They discussed theories. They photographed absence. The wall had become a symbol, a visual reminder that something extraordinary had happened, even if no one could quite explain how. The Louvre installed a temporary replacement, a modest frame, a label. It did nothing to satisfy anyone. The absence felt louder than the presence ever had. As weeks turned into months, the investigation lost coherence. Files thickened, leads grew cold, guards returned to routine, the museum reopened fully, though something intangible had shifted. People no longer trusted the building the same way, and the Mona Lisa, though unseen, was now everywhere. Vincenzo Perugia did not see himself as a criminal. That belief matters because it shaped every decision he made before and after the theft. He was born in northern Italy, in a region where work defined a man more reliably than ambition ever could. He learned a trade early: glasswork, measuring, cutting, fitting, repairing. It was precise work, quiet work, the kind that rewarded patience rather than imagination. When he arrived in Paris, he arrived the way thousands of men did at the turn of the century, with modest expectations and a willingness to disappear into labour. Paris welcomed workers while quietly resenting them. Foreign labour was tolerated, sometimes admired, often dismissed. Perugia noticed the distinction. He spoke French with an accent. He lived in small rooms. He was rarely invited into the social spaces where art was discussed rather than handled. But at the Louvre, his trade gave him something unusual: access. He installed glass. He adjusted frames. He moved through corridors that visitors never saw. He learned which doors stuck and which opened easily, which stairwells were quiet, which guards lingered and which drifted. He did not collect this information deliberately. It collected itself. Over time, he developed a familiarity with the building that felt almost personal. The Louvre was not a monument to him. It was a workplace, a place of routines and habits, and like all routines, those habits grew invisible. The Mona Lisa was part of that invisibility. He passed her often. He stood near her while working. He listened to conversations about her history, overheard fragments of explanation that hardened into conviction, that Leonardo was Italian, that the painting was Italian, that Napoleon had taken it to France. The last part was wrong, but it felt right. Facts, when absorbed indirectly, tend to settle where emotion guides them. In Perugia's mind, the painting did not belong here. It was misplaced, forgotten among too many other works, treated casually by Ford, who did not understand her origin. This belief did not arrive suddenly. It grew quietly, reinforced by small slights. Comments about Italians, jokes about foreign labour, the casual authority of men who discussed art but never touched it. Touch mattered to Perugia. He touched frames. He touched glass. He touched the physical reality of objects others spoke about abstractly. This gave him a sense of intimacy that felt like ownership, even if it was never articulated. The idea of taking the painting did not feel like theft to him. It felt like correction. When he acted, he did so without drama, without anger, without fear. The confidence he carried through the Louvre that morning was not criminal confidence, it was occupational confidence. The belief that what you are doing fits into the flow of the day. After the theft, he returned to his room and hid the painting inside a wooden trunk. Later, he concealed it behind a false panel in a cupboard. He wrapped it carefully, not lovingly, respectfully. Life continued. He worked. He ate. He slept. He followed the news. The newspapers fascinated him. Paris was panicking. France was embarrassed. The Mona Lisa was suddenly described as priceless, irreplaceable, iconic. words that had never followed her so aggressively before. This unsettled him. He had not meant to create a spectacle. He had not imagined that her absence would make her louder. He had believed that removing her would restore balance, not destroy it. 2 years passed. Waiting became its own burden. The longer he waited, the more complicated returning the painting became. She was too famous now, too symbolic. Any movement would draw attention. Any attempt to act quietly was no longer possible. Eventually, Perugia decided that attention was unavoidable. He contacted an art dealer in Florence under a false name. He claimed to possess the original Mona Lisa and requested authentication. He did not ask for ransom. He did not negotiate price. He wanted recognition, acknowledgement that the painting was Italian and that he had done something meaningful. The dealer agreed to meet. When the painting was revealed, there was no doubt. The authorities were notified immediately. Perugia did not resist arrest. He explained himself. The authentication of the painting did not unfold dramatically. There was no gasp, no sudden announcement, no theatrical confirmation. Instead, there was quiet concentration. The Mona Lisa was placed carefully on a table in Florence. Experts gathered around her not with excitement, but with restraint. They understood that certainty mattered more than speed. The painting was examined under controlled light. Magnification was used sparingly. Fingers hovered rather than touched. The signs were immediate to those who knew what to look for. The surface behaved exactly as Leonardo's paint should behave. The subtle transitions of tone were present, where copies flattened them. The craquelure followed known patterns. The wooden panel responded to light and shadow in a way that no modern reproduction could convincingly imitate. There was no doubt. News travelled quickly but unevenly. Italian newspapers reported the discovery with pride bordering on defiance. A masterpiece, long believed stolen by France, had been recovered by an Italian hand. The tone was nationalistic, without quite saying so. Perugia was described as misguided but sincere, a man who had acted out of loyalty rather than greed. French newspapers reacted defensively. Editorials appeared reminding readers that Leonardo had brought the painting to France himself, that the Mona Lisa had entered the French royal collection lawfully. That ownership was not a matter of sentiment, but history. The language was firm, corrective, occasionally sharp. The painting had become a proxy for something larger. Perugia was arrested quietly. There was no struggle, no attempt to flee. He answered questions calmly, almost with relief. Waiting had ended. The ambiguity that had weighed on him for 2 years was replaced by certainty, even if that certainty came with consequences. During interrogation, he did not deny the theft. He explained it. He spoke simply. He described the routines of the Louvre, the white smock, the stairwell, the locked door, the plumber who helped him without suspicion. He spoke without drama, as though recounting a series of practical steps rather than an act that had shaken an institution. This unsettled the investigators. They were accustomed to criminals who lied, boasted, or defended themselves aggressively. Perugia did none of these things. He repeated his reasoning calmly. The painting was Italian. He had returned it. When he was transferred back to France for trial, public interest intensified. The courtroom expected something else. A villain. A schemer. A provocateur. Instead, it received a quiet man who looked more like a tradesman than a criminal mastermind. He did not posture. He did not perform. He answered questions plainly. When asked why he had waited so long, he admitted uncertainty. He had not known what to do next. This honesty complicated everything. The prosecution attempted to frame the theft as calculated and deceptive. They emphasized the planning, the false name used to contact the dealer, the act of concealment. But each argument felt slightly misaligned with the man presenting himself before the court. Public opinion fractured. Some condemned him as a thief who had embarrassed France. Others viewed him as a misguided patriot who had been swallowed by a story larger than himself. Letters to newspapers debated intent versus outcome. Cartoons softened his image. Commentators struggled to agree on what justice should look like. The court compromised. Perugia was found guilty, but sentenced lightly, just over a year in prison, reduced further for time served. The punishment acknowledged the crime without fully condemning the motive. The Mona Lisa prepared to return to France. But she did not go quietly. Before the Mona Lisa returned to France, she travelled. Not far, geographically speaking, but far enough to alter her identity forever. Italian officials understood the moment immediately. The painting was no longer just a recovered artwork, it was a symbol. And symbols, once recovered, must be displayed. Quiet restitution would have wasted the opportunity. So instead, the Mona Lisa was shown publicly, first in Florence, then in Rome, then in Milan. The crowds were larger than expected. People queued for hours. Some travelled from neighbouring towns. Others came simply because everyone else was coming. Many admitted openly that they had never cared much for the painting before. That did not matter now. What mattered was proximity to something the world had recently agreed was important. The atmosphere around her was different from anything the Louvre had ever produced. There was pride, certainly. There was curiosity. But there was also a strange tenderness, as though the painting had survived an ordeal rather than simply changed locations. She was spoken about as though she had been wronged and restored. Language shapes perception. By the time she crossed the border back into France in January of 1914, the story had already solidified. The Mona Lisa was no longer a painting that had been stolen. She was a painting that had returned. The Louvre prepared carefully. This time, there would be no assumption of normality. The rehanging was deliberate, the placement reconsidered. Guards were assigned with explicit instructions. The museum understood, dimly at first, that the painting could no longer be treated like any other object in its care. Visitors arrived already informed. They knew the story. They knew the names. They knew what they were supposed to feel. The experience of seeing the Mona Lisa had been shaped in advance by newspapers, postcards, and conversation. She had become familiar without being seen. This familiarity was powerful. It changed the nature of attention. People no longer approached the painting to discover something. They approached to confirm something, to stand in front of the image they already carried in their minds. The press ensured that this familiarity did not fade. Images of the Mona Lisa were printed constantly, reproduced, resized, repurposed. Her face became shorthand for art itself. To reference her was to reference culture, sophistication, history. Artists responded quickly. Some copied her reverently, others mocked her gently. A few dismantled her entirely. Marcel Duchamp's altered version, complete with drawn moustache and irreverent title, landed precisely because the painting had become untouchable. You only parody icons. The Louvre adjusted again. Barriers appeared. Distance was enforced. The room was rearranged not to encourage contemplation, but to manage flow. Guards watched crowds rather than canvases. The painting became the still center of controlled movement. Visitors did not object. They expected this level of ceremony, and with expectation came permanence. The Mona Lisa had crossed a threshold that no amount of curatorial intention could undo. She was no longer simply an artwork to be studied. She was an event to be witnessed, a moment to be documented, a proof of presence. The theft had not damaged her. It had elevated her. There is a moment in the life of any famous object when admiration stops being passive. It leans forward. The Mona Lisa reached that moment quietly, without announcement, but once crossed, it could not be uncrossed. The painting was no longer simply viewed, it was approached, interpreted, tested, claimed in small, often unconscious ways by the people who stood before it. At first, this manifested as reverence. Voices lowered instinctively. People slowed their steps. Guards noticed visitors lingering longer than they had before, leaning forward as though proximity itself might offer understanding. But fame does not remain reverent for long. Over time, the painting ceased to be an artwork and became a surface upon which emotion could be projected. People arrived carrying expectations shaped not by Leonardo, but by repetition, by images seen everywhere, by stories retold endlessly, by the knowledge that this was the painting one was meant to see. Expectation is a dangerous companion to art. It creates entitlement. By the middle of the 20th century, the Mona Lisa had become something that people wanted to interact with rather than simply observe. They wanted closeness. They wanted contact. They wanted to leave some trace of themselves behind, however small. The first major attack came in 1956. A man threw acid at the painting. There was no coherent explanation offered that satisfied anyone. The act was sudden, shocking, and mercifully limited in damage. Restoration followed quickly, carefully, successfully. But the psychological effect lingered far longer than the physical one. The Mona Lisa was no longer vulnerable only to neglect. She was vulnerable to obsession. Later that same year, another visitor threw a stone. It struck the protective glass and chipped paint near the painting's elbow. Again, restoration was possible. Again, the message was unmistakable. The painting could no longer exist unmediated. Glass became mandatory, not decorative glass, not polite barriers, thick, impact-resistant layers designed not only to protect the surface, but to create distance, emotional as well as physical. The Mona Lisa retreated behind technology, and technology stepped forward as her interpreter. Climate control followed. Temperature and humidity were stabilized to an exactness that bordered on obsession. Sensors monitored vibration. Light exposure was calculated carefully, balancing visibility against preservation. The painting's environment became a controlled ecosystem rather than a gallery. And still, people pressed forward. As the decades passed, incidents continued. Less destructive, but no less telling. Tea thrown, cake smeared. Protest gestures disguised as absurdity, designed to slip past security long enough to make a point. Each attempt failed. Each attempt reinforced the same truth. The Mona Lisa was no longer simply valuable. She was irresistible. The Louvre adapted again and then again. Guards were trained differently. Behavior mattered more than appearance. Lingering too long, approaching too quickly, moving erratically, these became signals. The room itself was redesigned to manage people rather than display art. Barriers guided movement. Distance was enforced without explanation. The experience of seeing the painting became brief, controlled, communal. Visitors did not complain. They expected this. This expectation is the final transformation. People no longer arrive hoping to study the painting. They arrive hoping to say they have seen it. The encounter becomes transactional. Wait, enter, glimpse, exit. Phones rise, screens glow. The glass reflects faces more clearly than the paint behind it. Some leave disappointed. Others leave satisfied simply by proximity. Very few leave with the sense that they have encountered the painting itself. This is not failure, it is consequence. The theft did not merely elevate the Mona Lisa, it pushed her beyond intimacy. She became too important to be approached quietly ever again. Modern museum security rarely announces itself. It does not clang or flash or demand attention. Its purpose is not to intimidate, but to shape behavior quietly, guiding people into compliance without forcing them to notice they are being guided at all. This philosophy did not emerge by accident. It is the long echo of mistakes. The theft of the Mona Lisa forced museums to confront an uncomfortable reality. The greatest danger to cultural objects does not usually come from dramatic intrusion. It comes from normality, from people who appear to belong, from routines that stop being questioned because they have worked for so long. Before 1911, the Louvre trusted appearance. Uniforms signalled legitimacy. Tools implied purpose. Confidence suggested permission. There was no systematic distinction between those who should have access and those who merely looked like they did. After the theft, this way of thinking began to erode. Slowly at first, institutions resist acknowledging that their instincts are flawed, but over time, rules hardened, roles narrowed, access was compartmentalized. Workers were no longer simply present. They were identified, logged, restricted to specific zones during specific hours. Uniforms stopped being enough. Today, the Mona Lisa is housed behind laminated, bullet-resistant glass engineered to withstand impact without shattering. The glass itself is only one part of a larger system. It is sealed into a climate-controlled case designed to regulate temperature and humidity, with obsessive precision, protecting the wooden panel from expansion, contraction, and microscopic stress. Sensors monitor vibration constantly. Even subtle shifts trigger alerts. Airflow is filtered and measured. Light exposure is calculated carefully, balancing visibility against long-term preservation. Nothing about the painting's environment is left to chance. But the most significant protections are human. Guards assigned to the Mona Lisa are trained not just to observe, but to interpret. They study behavior more than movement. They watch posture, pace, attention. Lingering becomes a signal. Hesitation becomes a question. Approach speed matters as much as distance. The room itself participates in this vigilance. Barriers are not placed randomly. They guide movement in predictable arcs. Crowd flow is engineered to prevent bottlenecks, agitation, and fixation. People are kept moving not by force, but by design. This is the lesson the theft taught most clearly. Not that art must be hidden, but that access must be intentional. The Mona Lisa's gallery is no longer arranged for contemplation. It is arranged for management. The painting is the still center of a controlled system, and everything around her exists to regulate the experience of being near her. Visitors accept this instinctively. They have been trained by expectation. They queue patiently. They raise phones automatically. They take photographs quickly. They move on. The encounter is brief, compressed, communal. This brevity is not accidental. It is protection. And yet, something remains unresolved, because no amount of technology can fully solve the problem the Mona Lisa represents. She must be visible to matter, and visibility invites pressure. There is a temptation, when telling stories like this, to look for a moment of closure, an arrest, a sentence, a painting returned to its wall. But the theft of the Mona Lisa resists that shape. It does not end cleanly because it did not begin dramatically. It unfolded quietly, patiently, through habits no one thought to question. Its consequences have unfolded the same way, slowly, persistently, without ever quite announcing themselves. The man who took the painting returned to obscurity. He served his sentence. He lived the remainder of his life without fame, remembered only when the story required a name. History rarely knows what to do with people who act without spectacle. logical. It reduces them to explanations rather than characters. The painting did the opposite. She absorbed meaning far beyond anything Leonardo could have anticipated. National pride, institutional failure, celebrity, vulnerability. She became a mirror for how the modern world assigns value, not through understanding, but through repetition and attention. It is worth sitting with how unremarkable the crime actually was. No alarms disabled, no guards outwitted, no dramatic escape, just familiarity. A uniform no one questioned, a routine no one examined, a building confident enough to believe nothing could happen inside it. That is why the theft still matters. Not because it was clever, but because it was ordinary. Museums across the world quietly rewrote their assumptions in the years that followed. They did not simply add alarms and glass. They reconsidered trust. They learned to be suspicious of normality, to ask questions not when something looked wrong, but when it looked too right. This shift changed how institutions functioned far beyond art. Libraries, archives, galleries, all absorbed the lesson that access must be designed, not assumed. And yet, even with all of this, the Mona Lisa remains an unresolved object. She exists now behind glass thick enough to stop bullets, in a room engineered to manage crowds rather than contemplation. She is watched constantly, not because she is fragile in the physical sense, but because she is desired. Millions of eyes pass over her every year. Millions of expectations arrive with them. People lean forward, phones raised, trying to capture something personal from her expression. A private understanding, a moment of recognition. She does not respond. She remains exactly what she has always been. A woman painted in oil, mid-thought, uninterested in explanation. The theft did not change her face. It changed how we look at it. Today, people travel across continents to see her and spend seconds in her presence. They photograph glass. They document crowds. They leave satisfied simply to have been near something the world agrees matters. This is not a failure of appreciation. It is a consequence of fame. The Mona Lisa cannot disappear again, not physically and not culturally. She has been removed once, and that absence taught the world how to want her. Nothing is more permanent than that lesson, and perhaps that is the quietest irony of all. A painting taken by one man, in silence, without resistance, became the most watched object in human history, not because of what was done to her, but because of what her disappearance revealed. That permanence is an illusion, that attention is dangerous, and that sometimes the moment something vanishes is the moment we finally decide it matters.